She was slapped in public, but her revenge changed the world. Before we dive in, family, make sure you subscribe to Black Journey and hit that bell because I share powerful news stories with you every single day. Now sit back, relax, and let me take you into this amazing story you don't want to miss. The city of Chicago pulsed with winter energy, a restless rhythm that wrapped around the glowing towers and icy streets. The Art Institute, dressed in golden light, stood like a beacon of sophistication that evening. Outside, sleek black cars lined the entrance, their doors opening to reveal gowns worth fortunes and tuxedos tailored to perfection. The Coleman family had arrived early, taking their usual place as the unofficial rulers of the gala. Dorothy Coleman, matriarch of the dynasty, exuded an air of hauteur sharpened by decades of power and money. Beside her, Senator William Coleman shook hands with donors as if campaigning were stitched into his very blood. Their children, Robert Jr. and Sophia, lingered close. Robert restless and brash, Sophia glued to her phone, streaming fragments of the night to the millions who worshipped her curated life. Inside, chandeliers shimmered above marble floors, and the hum of expensive laughter carried through the gallery. The gala was meant to celebrate artistry, but in truth it was a theater of status, a parade of who belonged and who did not. It was here that Sarah Jenkins walked in, her dress simple, black and unadorned, her heels modest, her presence quiet. She held herself with dignity, her eyes absorbing the paintings and sculptures with a reverence that none of the Colemans would notice. It began innocently enough. A guest mistook Sarah for a staff member, asking for directions to the restroom. Sarah responded politely, unbothered, but the slight did not go unnoticed by Dorothy. When Sarah later paused near the family's circle, gazing at a piece of abstract art, Dorothy's eyes narrowed. The matriarch leaned toward her son, her voice dripping with disdain. "She doesn't belong here. Look at her dress." Robert Jr. smirked, adjusting his cufflinks. "Cheap fabric. Probably slipped in hoping for free champagne." His voice carried just enough for Sarah to hear. Sophia, sensing entertainment for her followers, tilted her phone to capture the moment. "Live streaming the Coleman Gala drama," she whispered, her lips curling with mischief. And then Dorothy acted. In a sudden, shocking gesture, she raised her hand and struck Sarah across the face, a slap that echoed like thunder against the marble. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sarah froze, her hand slowly touching the sting on her cheek. Around her, murmurs rose. Who is she? Why was she slapped? Security guards moved closer, uncertain of what was unfolding. William Coleman, his voice, loud and commanding, stepped forward with the authority of a senator. "Madam, you are trespassing. This is a private event. If you don't leave immediately, you will be arrested." The world seemed to tilt, but Sarah stood unmoving. Her face was calm, her eyes steady, her silence unnerving. Sophia's phone streamed live as comments poured in, half ridiculing Sarah, half condemning the Colemans' arrogance. Dorothy's chin lifted higher, believing she had defended her family's reputation. Robert Jr. chuckled under his breath, the predator certain of his prey. But Sarah Jenkins was no prey. She was the storm no one saw coming. With deliberate grace, she reached into her purse and drew out her phone. Unlocking the screen, she opened a digital folder and turned the display toward the security guards. There, unmistakable, glowed her Forbes profile. Sarah Jenkins, billionaire CEO of Zenith Aerospace. Net worth, $5.70 billion. A collective gasp rippled through the gala. The guards froze, confusion flooding their eyes. Sarah swiped again, revealing direct message threads with Pentagon officials, their insignias stamped at the top. Strategic aerospace contracts. National defense approvals. Her fingerprints were on every deal that touched the skies. The silence was suffocating. Dorothy's painted lips trembled. Robert Jr.'s smugness curdled into shock. Sophia's live audience exploded in comments that would never be deleted. William's face paled, the weight of his political career crashing into realization. Sarah's voice, when it finally came, was steady, low but commanding enough to silence the entire hall. You've mistaken dignity for weakness, she said. And tonight you've humiliated not a guest but the woman who controls the contracts that keep your companies alive, your investments profitable, your foundations funded, and your political campaigns breathing. The gala was no longer about art. It was about reckoning. Dorothy's hand trembled at her side. The matriarch, who never faltered, looked suddenly fragile. Robert Jr. tried to recover, stammering, We didn't know." But Sarah cut him off with a raised palm. "You didn't care to know. That's the disease of privilege. You assume everyone beneath you is disposable." The security guards, now visibly uneasy, stepped back. All eyes fixed on Sarah, the billionaire in a plain dress, who held more power in that moment than the family who once ruled the room. The humiliation had reversed. The Colemans had weaponized shame, but Sarah wielded truth, and truth, when revealed, was devastating. Still, comma. Sarah was not finished. Her revelation was not just about vengeance, it was about leverage. She had endured the slap, the mockery, the public degradation, but now she would demand restitution. Not in whispers, but in terms that would bend an entire dynasty. She stepped closer to the Colemans, her voice ringing through the marble hall like the notes of a judgment song. "Here are my conditions," she said. "Dorothy, you will issue a public apology, resign from every board you sit on, and your foundation will donate $10 million to the NACP. Robert Jr., your company will implement diversity reforms across all levels, or lose every Zenith contract you cling to. Sophia, you will use your influence to uplift Black-owned businesses, not mock them. And Senator Coleman, you will champion equality legislation, or your campaign will drown under the weight of my disclosure." The Colemans stood paralyzed, their faces masks of disbelief and horror. The guests around them whispered furiously, some reaching for their phones, others daring not to move. The air was electric, charged with a justice long overdue. Sarah ended with a final, piercing declaration: "If you do not comply, I will dismantle everything you've built. Your wealth, your influence, your legacies, brick by brick, contract by contract, investment by investment, until your name is nothing but a cautionary tale." Her words lingered in the air like the final stroke of a gavel, and for the first time in their lives, the Coleman family understood what it meant to be powerless. The silence inside the Art Institute grew unbearable, as though every guest had forgotten how to breathe. The slap, the insult, the threat, all of it hung heavy, suspended in the air like smoke. The Colemans, once untouchable, now stood cornered. Their empire, their reputations, their illusions of superiority trembled in Sarah Jenkins's hands. Dorothy Coleman was the first to speak, though her voice faltered. For decades, she had commanded boardrooms, foundations, and society luncheons, with effortless arrogance. Yet now her lips quivered, her words weak. "Miss Jenkins, surely we can. This has been a misunderstanding." She reached for Sarah's arm, but Sarah drew back with quiet dignity. "There was no misunderstanding," Sarah said, her voice slicing clean through the air. "There was only your certainty that I did not belong." Her gaze lingered on Dorothy, steady and unflinching. "You did not ask who I was, you decided, and in that decision you revealed everything." Robert Jr., who moments earlier mocked Sarah's dress, tried to mask his fear with bravado. He tugged at his cufflinks and forced a laugh that sounded more like a choke. "Look, we got carried away. These events are stressful. Maybe we—" Sarah's eyes turned to him, cold and unyielding. "Stress doesn't breed cruelty, character does." The word struck harder than Dorothy's slap ever could. Robert Jr.'s smirk collapsed into silence. Sophia, phone still clutched in hand, realized her live stream had become a weapon against her own family. The comments scrolled mercilessly. Did she just slap a billionaire? Cancel the Colemans. Now, that's Sarah Jenkins, Forbes' top list. The numbers had climbed into the millions. She quickly ended the stream, her hands shaking, but it was too late. Screenshots, recordings, reactions, already viral. Senator William Coleman, who built his career on commanding crowds, now struggled to find his voice. He cleared his throat, but the booming authority that once carried across Senate floors faltered. "Miss Jenkins, surely threats aren't necessary. We can negotiate terms." Sarah stepped closer, her heels clicking against marble with the precision of a gavel. She stopped only a few feet from him, her presence towering without raising her voice. "You threatened to have me arrested for existing in a space you believed was yours alone. You leveraged your title, your power, your privilege to humiliate me in public, and now you call my terms threats? No, Senator, these are corrections. Corrections you will obey if you wish to keep what little honor your name has left." The crowd stirred uneasily. Some guests who had once idolized the Colemans now looked at Sarah with awe. Her composure was unnerving. She did not raise her voice. She did not tremble. She did not falter. In her stillness lay her power. Sarah gave the family one final chance to respond. "Your silence tonight will decide your tomorrow. You have until dawn." With that, she turned her back on them, the ultimate act of control, and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted like water around her, whispers trailing in her wake. The Colemans remained frozen in their humiliation, but the gala moved on. Guests tried to resume polite conversations, though their laughter rang hollow, their champagne soured by what they had witnessed. For once, the Colemans found themselves not at the center of attention, but the target of it. Dorothy's cheek twitched as she forced herself to smile at acquaintances who avoided her eyes. Robert Jr. stepped outside for air, trembling. Sophia sat in a corner, furiously typing apologies onto her socials that no one believed. And William disappeared into a private lounge, his mind racing through polls, headlines, and potential. Ruin. Outside, Sarah Jenkins stood on the steps of the Art Institute, the night air biting cold against her skin. The sting of Dorothy's slap still burned faintly, but it was nothing compared to the deeper wound, the knowledge that, in their eyes, she had been invisible until she wielded her wealth as a shield. She tilted her head back, gazing at the Chicago skyline. The city glittered, uncaring, yet Sarah's chest rose with quiet determination. Tonight was not merely about personal vindication. Tonight was about exposing a system that allowed the Colemans and countless others like them to treat human dignity as optional. Her driver pulled up in a sleek, obsidian black car. Sarah slipped into the back seat, closing the door softly behind her. The warmth wrapped around her, but her mind did not rest. She replayed each face, each word, each insult. Her phone buzzed. Dozens of messages from executives, journalists, even Pentagon officials. News of the incident had already reached the highest offices. She ignored them for now. She needed silence. Clarity. The city streets rolled by as she considered the enormity of what had just unfolded. She had not planned this confrontation. She had intended to attend quietly, to view the art, to exist without fanfare. But humiliation had cornered her, and in that corner she found a new weapon, leverage fused with principle. She did not seek their ruin for sport. She sought it as a lesson, a correction, a blueprint for dismantling arrogance disguised as power. Meanwhile, inside the Art Institute, the Colemans regrouped. In a private suite, Dorothy demanded answers. This woman, how could we not know her? How did we not see her coming? Her voice cracked, her eyes red. Robert Jr. slammed a glass onto the table. She can't just ruin us. We have lawyers. We have connections. You fool, William snapped, his voice sharper than ever. Do you realize who she is? Zenith Aerospace controls every major defense contract in this country. Half of our campaign donors rely on her company. Your businesses exist because she allows them to. Sophia's entire portfolio, worthless without Zenith-backed ventures. Dorothy, your foundation? Funded by corporate partners who need her contracts. She holds us all by the throat. Sophia whimpered, her phone buzzing relentlessly with alerts. The live stream. It's everywhere. Mom, I didn't mean to. Dorothy turned on her daughter with sudden fury. You broadcasted our shame to millions. But the anger quickly collapsed into despair. She sank into her chair, whispering, We are finished. For a long moment, no one spoke. The empire they had built, the aura of invincibility, all of it teetered on the edge of collapse. They had humiliated a woman they believed beneath them, only to discover she could dismantle everything they touched. William finally broke the silence. "We have no choice, we comply. At least then we survive." Dorothy's lips pressed into a thin line, but she did not argue. Robert Jr. buried his face in his hands. Sophia typed out another shaky apology. The Colemans, once masters of Chicago society, had been reduced to pawns overnight, and Sarah Jenkins, the woman they had sought to erase, now stood poised to redefine the rules. As the night deepened, Chicago carried on. Taxis honked, snow drifted onto sidewalks, neon signs flickered in the distance. But inside the Coleman suite, the air was thick with fear. Every tick of the clock drew them closer to dawn. The deadline Sarah had set. And Sarah, staring out the car window as the city lights blurred, knew this was only the beginning. Dignity, once dismissed, was about to become the most powerful weapon in America's corridors of power. The sun had barely broken the horizon when Chicago woke to headlines that burned across every screen. Coleman family humiliates billionaire CEO at gala. Zenith Aerospace chief confronts power dynasty. Live-streamed slap sparks national. Outrage. The story spread like wildfire, igniting debates on television, radio, and social media. Clips of Dorothy's slap and William's threat replayed endlessly, dissected by pundits, condemned by activists, devoured by millions who had grown tired of watching the privileged operate without consequence. By mid-morning, reporters swarmed outside the Coleman estate. Protesters gathered with signs, "Dignity is not a luxury." "End privilege politics." "Stand with Sarah Jenkins." The gates that once symbolized exclusivity now felt like prison bars. Inside, Dorothy sat at a long dining table, her face pale, her pearls absent, her hands trembling around a porcelain cup she could not drink from. "We must move quickly," William urged, pacing across the room. His tie was loosened, his hair unkempt. The senator who once commanded Senate floors with rehearsed precision now looked worn, cornered. "If we delay, we bleed out in public. Jenkins gave us terms, and we comply. That's the only way forward." Robert Jr. bristled. "So we just hand her everything she wants? She's not even an elected official, she's a businesswoman. She embarrassed us, and now she owns you," William snapped. "Your company lives off Zenith contracts. You disobey, you collapse. Don't delude yourself." Dorothy finally spoke, her voice hollow. "She wants an apology. From me. Public, not private. Do you know what that means? 40 years of reputation undone, every board, every committee. It means survival." William cut her off. His tone was steel. "You humiliated her in public. Now you will restore her dignity in public, or we all go down together." Sophia sat at the far end of the table, scrolling through endless messages. Brands had begun dropping her as a partner. Followers accused her of complicity, of cruelty. "They've canceled me," she whispered almost to herself. "Everything I built, it's gone overnight." She looked up at her family with wide, desperate eyes. "What if it never comes back?" Robert Jr. scoffed. "You'll survive. I'm the one facing ruin here." Dorothy slammed her hand on the table, the porcelain cup rattling. "Enough. Do you not see? We are already ruined. All that remains is whether we crawl from the ashes or burn completely." The room fell silent. For once, the Colemans felt the same despair that countless families, dismissed and disregarded by them, had long endured. The arrogance was gone. In its place, fear. At noon, the Colemans called a press conference. Cameras filled the hotel ballroom, flashes striking like lightning as reporters jostled for position. Dorothy walked to the podium first, her heels clicking across the stage, each step heavier than the last. Her hands clutched the paper she had rewritten a dozen times. For a woman who had never once apologized in public, the words cut like glass. Her voice cracked at the first sentence. "Last night I committed a grave injustice against a guest at the Art Institute gala. I struck a woman who did not deserve it. I allowed prejudice, arrogance, and entitlement to guide my actions. For that I offer not excuses but apology. Public, sincere, and unconditional to Miss Sarah Jenkins. Reporters scribbled furiously. Flashes illuminated her trembling face. Dorothy forced herself to continue. Effective immediately, I resign from all boards on which I serve. Furthermore, the Coleman Foundation will donate $10 million to the NAACP to support equality and justice initiatives. She paused, her throat tightening. This is not charity. This is correction. She stepped back from the podium. Her shoulders slumped. For the first time in decades, Dorothy Coleman looked small. Robert Jr. followed, his jaw clenched, his pride stripped. As CEO of Coleman Industries, I announced the implementation of comprehensive diversity reforms. Our leadership hiring practices and contracts will reflect the reality of the country we live in, not the narrow world I allowed myself to believe in. This is not optional. It is overdue. The words tasted bitter in his mouth, but behind the bitterness was survival. Sophia took the podium next. Her hands shook as she held the microphone. I live-streamed humiliation. I mocked where I should have uplifted. I have used my platform for vanity, not justice. That ends today. From this moment forward, my influence will highlight and promote Black-owned businesses, creators, and voices. To those I hurt, I hear you. I will do better. The final speaker was William. The senator's deep voice carried across the ballroom. As a public servant, my duty is equality. Last night I betrayed that duty. In the coming weeks, I will introduce and champion legislation aimed at dismantling systemic discrimination in business, in politics, in education. To those who believed I was their ally, I will earn that title anew. The conference ended in chaos, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, but the message was clear. The Colemans had bent. They had complied. Sarah Jenkins watched, from her office, the press conference streaming on a wall-sized screen. Her staff hovered nearby, exchanging glances, whispering disbelief at the sight of the once mighty Colemans brought low. Sarah remained still, her hands folded on the desk, her expression unreadable. One of her advisors, a tall woman with silver hair, finally spoke. You've done what no one thought possible. You brought them to their knees. Sarah shook her head. I didn't bring them to their knees, their arrogance did. I only held up the mirror. Still, her chest ached. Not from the slap, though the sting lingered in memory, but from the deeper wound, knowing how many others had endured humiliation without the shield of wealth to protect them. For every Sarah Jenkins who could fight back, there were millions who could not. That night across Chicago, debates raged. Was Sarah Jenkins a hero or a tyrant? Was this justice or revenge? Was dignity best defended by quiet endurance or public leverage? But among the marginalized, the disenfranchised, the overlooked, Sarah's stand became a symbol. A woman had been humiliated in front of the world, and she had answered not with silence but with power. In the Coleman estate, the family sat in exhausted silence after the press conference. Their names were trending, their reputations shattered, but for now they had survived. William poured a glass of whiskey with trembling hands. Dorothy sat staring at nothing. Robert Jr. scrolled through furious board emails. Sophia cried quietly into her phone. The empire they had ruled for decades had not collapsed yet, but its walls were cracked and its foundation shaken. And in those cracks, a new possibility began to grow. Change. For Sarah, this was only the opening act. The conditions were met, but the real test would be in the months to come. Would the Colemans truly change, or would they simply comply until the storm passed? Sarah intended to find out. Because dignity was not a one-night demand. It was a revolution. 6 months passed, yet the memory of that night at the Art Institute remained etched into Chicago's consciousness. What had begun as a scandal had evolved into something larger, a turning point, a catalyst. The Coleman Protocols, as the press named them, were no longer simply the conditions Sarah Jenkins had imposed. They had become a model. Corporations whispered the phrase in boardrooms, activists invoked it in rallies, and lawmakers debated it in chambers. For the first time in decades, the Colemans were not the center of power. They were the example, the caution, and the evidence that systemic arrogance could be bent into reform. Dorothy Coleman was perhaps the most surprising transformation. The woman who once wore pearls like armor and wielded foundation galas as stages for superiority had stripped away her veneer. She appeared now without the extravagant gowns, without the entourage. She walked into community meetings humbly, sometimes in simple slacks and flats, her hair pulled back, her voice quieter than before. At first, those she addressed distrusted her, their eyes hard with suspicion. But Dorothy did not flee from that suspicion. She leaned into it. She stood in church basements and community halls telling the truth aloud. Privilege blinded me. I believed philanthropy was a stage for me to shine, not a bridge to serve others. I struck a woman not because she was wrong, but because I believed her dignity was beneath mine. That arrogance ends now. Her foundation's $10 million donation to the NAACP had been only the beginning. She began championing anti-privilege initiatives across the city, demanding that the wealthy give not just money, but voice, influence, and accountability. For the first time, people began to look at Dorothy Coleman not with fear or envy, but with cautious respect. Her transformation was not immediate, nor was it universally accepted, but it was real. Robert Jr. faced a steeper climb. His company, Coleman Industries, once a bastion of exclusivity, had nearly collapsed under public boycott. Shareholders threatened to flee, contracts evaporated. But Sarah's conditions had been his lifeline. Forced to implement diversity reforms, Robert discovered something he had never allowed himself to believe. Inclusivity did not weaken his company. It strengthened it. Within months, Black engineers, women executives, Latino designers, and Asian strategists filled the hallways of Coleman Industries. Innovation flourished where stagnation once reigned. Ideas he had dismissed in boardrooms before now became products that attracted global markets. By the end of 6 months, the company's value had rebounded, stronger than before, not in spite of diversity but because of it. Robert Jr., who once mocked Sarah's plain attire, now stood at conferences speaking of equity as a competitive advantage. The words came haltingly at first, unpolished but genuine. His arrogance was not gone. Arrogance rarely disappears overnight, but it had been dented, reshaped, redefined. Sophia's transformation played out in the most public arena of all, social media. Once a queen of vanity, her follower count had plummeted after the scandal. Brands abandoned her. But instead of clinging to what she had lost, Sophia leaned into Sarah's demand. She began spotlighting Black-owned businesses daily, boutiques in Chicago's South Side, tech startups in Atlanta, restaurants in Harlem. At first, cynics dismissed it as rebranding, a desperate ploy. But something shifted. The more she engaged with entrepreneurs, the more she listened to their stories, the more genuine her voice became. She stopped posting selfies with champagne glasses and started posting interviews with founders who spoke about struggle and resilience. Slowly, her audience returned, not the shallow millions who once followed her for glamour, but a new community that respected her voice. One night, Sophia recorded a video in her bedroom, makeup minimal, her tone raw. 6 months ago, I thought influence was about attention, but influence means nothing if it doesn't uplift. Sarah Jenkins showed me that, and I'm still learning every day. The video went viral, but this time for the right reasons. Senator William Coleman, however, faced the heaviest scrutiny. His political career teetered on collapse after the gala. Opponents seized on the footage. Voters condemned his arrogance. But William did what few believed he could. He turned the humiliation into policy. True to his promise, he introduced legislation addressing systemic discrimination in business and politics. He pushed for equity in government contracts, protections against discriminatory hiring, and accountability measures for corporations. The bills faced fierce resistance, yet William pressed on, invoking his own disgrace as evidence of why reform was necessary. I stood on a stage and threatened a woman because I believed my power outweighed her dignity, he admitted in a Senate speech. That belief is the sickness we must cure. The words echoed across the nation. Activists who had once despised him now found themselves surprised, cautious, but willing to engage. His approval ratings began to stabilize, not because people forgot the gala, but because they saw that even the powerful could change when forced to confront their reflection. Through all of this, Sarah Jenkins remained deliberate, watchful. She did not gloat, she did not flaunt her victory. Instead, she monitored. Her team compiled quarterly reports on the Coleman family's compliance. She read them carefully, her sharp eyes scanning for insincerity. She demanded accountability, and when she found genuine change, she acknowledged it. Privately, Sarah wrestled with the weight of what she had done. Power was a dangerous tool. Wielded carelessly, it became vengeance rather than justice. She had walked a narrow line, and though the world called her a hero, Sarah knew her work was not about heroism. It was about correction. In moments of solitude, she thought of the millions of people without her shield of wealth. She remembered the sting of Dorothy's slap, not because of the pain, but because it was a reminder. Even a billionaire dressed simply could be rendered invisible. Dignity, she realized, was not safeguarded by fortune. It had to be fought for every day by everyone. And so, Sarah expanded her vision. She began working with coalitions of business leaders, activists, and policymakers to codify what the press had dubbed the Coleman Protocols. Companies across the country adopted similar reforms, compelled by pressure or inspired by change. Foundations redirected their wealth toward equity initiatives. Influencers redefined their platforms. The world was watching, and the ripple Sarah had created was growing into a wave. Back at the Coleman estate, the family gathered one evening for dinner. An ordinary act, yet for them, extraordinary. The air was no longer thick with arrogance. Dorothy spoke softly of a community project she was funding. Robert Jr. described a new product line born from a diverse design team. Sophia read aloud a message from a Black-owned business she had promoted, thanking her for doubling their sales. William recounted a meeting with activists who, for the first time, shook his hand without disdain. For a moment, they were not a dynasty under siege. They were a family, fractured but repairing, humbled but learning. And somewhere in her high-rise office, Sarah Jenkins looked out over Chicago, the skyline shimmering against the night. She knew their transformation was not complete. Arrogance did not vanish in 6 months. But she also knew that seeds had been planted, roots had begun to grow. The slap that once symbolized humiliation now symbolized a movement. The winter night of the gala had become legend, retold in articles, classrooms, podcasts, and living rooms across the world. What began as humiliation had transformed into a doctrine. The Coleman Protocols were no longer confined to Chicago. They had become a blueprint for reform far beyond America's borders. Sarah Jenkins' name now carried a weight not only in aerospace, not only in business, but in culture and justice. She had become a symbol, not because she was wealthy, but because she had refused to let dignity be treated as a privilege. In London, corporations cited the Coleman Protocols while restructuring their boards. In Johannesburg, activists used the story to demand equity in government contracts. In Tokyo, business schools analyzed the incident as a case study in leadership and humility. The slap had echoed across oceans not as a wound but as a catalyst. Sarah Jenkins had not planned for this kind of legacy, yet she bore it with quiet resolve. In interviews, she refused to cast herself as a savior. "I am one woman who happened to have leverage," she told a journalist. "But the real story is not me. The real story is that power can be bent. Systems can be forced to change. And if they can bend to me, they can bend to you, to us, to anyone who refuses to be erased." She did not sugarcoat the struggle. "It should not take billions of dollars to defend dignity," she said in one address, her voice steady, her eyes unflinching. "That is the sickness we must cure." The Colemans continued to walk the line between penance and transformation. Dorothy became a surprising advocate in circles that once sneered at the very idea of anti-privilege activism. She stood before gatherings of Chicago's elite, confessing openly to her arrogance. Some turned away, others listened. But the power of her confession was not in its perfection, it was in its rawness. She had become a mirror for her peers, forcing them to see themselves in her fall. Robert Jr. rebuilt his company brick by brick, learning that inclusion was not charity but brilliance. His boardrooms looked different now, his teams sharper, his strategies bolder. He had been humbled, and in humility, he discovered prosperity. The man who once laughed at Sarah's dress now sought counsel from those he once overlooked. Sophia grew into an influencer of substance. She still posted, but her platform had shifted. She showcased entrepreneurs, artists, activists. She launched a fund supporting young Black creators, and her following, though smaller than before, was stronger, more loyal. She often spoke of Sarah Jenkins as the force that reshaped her. "She held me accountable when the world let me float," Sophia said in one live stream. "She taught me that the mirror we avoid is the mirror we need most." And William, Senator Coleman, became a fierce advocate in Washington. His bills did not all pass, but his persistence carved a path for those who would follow. He spoke of equity not as theory, but as necessity. When questioned about his motives, he did not hide. "I was humbled before the nation. I carry that humility as penance, but also as purpose." His words were not always believed, but they were always remembered. Through it all, Sarah Jenkins remained steady, deliberate, almost detached. She did not bask in the Coleman's transformation, nor in her own growing fame. Instead, she worked tirelessly to expand the framework she had set in motion. She convened summits with CEOs, activists, and policymakers. She invested in organizations dismantling systemic bias. She established scholarships for young Black engineers and entrepreneurs. One evening, nearly a year after the gala, Sarah was invited to speak at the very place where it all began, the Art Institute of Chicago. The gala hall had been transformed into a forum on dignity, equity, and systemic reform. The irony was not lost on her. She walked the same marble floor, but this time, the crowd looked at her not with scorn, not with suspicion, but with respect. She stepped to the podium. Silence fell. "I stand here tonight not as the billionaire you read about, not as the CEO of Zenith Aerospace, but as a woman who was slapped across the face for daring to exist in a plain dress. That slap was not just about me. It was about every person whose dignity has been dismissed because they did not look the part, because they did not fit the mold, because privilege mistook them for invisible. But dignity," she paused, her voice rising, "is never invisible. Dignity is unshakable. Dignity is the one possession no one can steal unless we let them." The audience leaned forward, breathless. "I demanded accountability from one family," she continued, "but accountability must become culture. The Coleman protocols are not theirs alone, they are ours. They are every boardroom, every foundation, every platform, every office, every hall of power. They are not about humiliation, they are about correction. They are about building systems where no one has to wield billions to defend their worth." Her voice softened, carrying more weight than volume ever could. "Privilege will resist. Arrogance will sneer. But when we hold the line, when we demand not just apologies but transformation, then dignity wins. And when dignity wins, humanity moves forward." The hall erupted in applause, but Sarah did not smile. She stood tall, calm, her eyes scanning the faces before her. She knew the work was unfinished, it would always be unfinished. But she also knew that one night, one slap, one stand had planted seeds that would grow far beyond her lifetime. Later that night, she walked out onto the museum steps, the same steps she had descended 6 months earlier under humiliation and silence. The Chicago skyline shimmered, its towers etched against the night sky. Snow drifted softly, catching the streetlights like falling stars. Sarah pulled her coat tighter and breathed in the cold air. She thought of her mother, who once told her, "They will try to erase you, Sarah, do not let them. Even if you stand alone, stand." Sarah had stood, and in standing she had proven that dignity was not weakness, but the sharpest blade against injustice. The Colemans, the city, the nation, even the world, none would ever be the same. And somewhere, far beyond Chicago, In the hearts of countless unseen people who had been dismissed, overlooked, or humiliated, a new belief took root. If Sarah Jenkins could stand, so can I. That was her true legacy. Not billions, not aerospace, not even the protocols. Her legacy was the courage she had awakened in others. And as the night deepened, Sarah Jenkins stepped into her car, her silhouette framed against the museum lights. The door closed, and the vehicle pulled away into the city's rhythm. Behind her, the Art Institute glowed golden against the dark. Ahead of her, the road stretched limitless. The movement had only begun. This story shows us that dignity can defeat privilege, and justice can spark change. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to Black Journey for more powerful stories.